despite the console's success, it was cluttered with problems. And Ryan, you did a great job of explaining why it was important to talk about all that. So to sort of piggyback from that, despite that, why do you think this console was so dominating for most of the generation when compared to the PS3? When, for context, at the very end of the console war, which is a dumb term, but let's just go with that, the 360 sold 84 million consoles to the PS3's 87.4. So right neck and neck. Why do you think that was?
The first thing that we got to talk about is that the Xbox 360 was first to the market, right? They had a whole year ahead on PS3. And the thing was, despite all of the problems, because, we talked about last week, rushing it was an issue, and obviously was one of the reasons, because they developed their own chip or something
they
caused
eventually
a
had
lot
to
of
change the chip because they tried to save some money, and it cost them a lot in the end.
And that basically was one of the core reasons behind the Red Ring of Death. But still, being first to market with an HD console and kind of setting the tone was a big reason for that early momentum. Usually you're going to get that early momentum if you're first to market regardless. But the thing that really kept Xbox 360 ahead was that PlayStation 3 just kept getting in its own way. So I thought Sony definitely had a lot of foresight for some great things, such as Blu-ray technology and having the wireless chargeable controllers be so much better than what Xbox 360 had for their controllers. So they had some great ideas, but Xbox also had great ideas as well. So we talk about achievements and, their UI. A lot of people like a lot more than PlayStation 3. But yeah, PlayStation's price point and just lack of early games at launch really kind of had people shying away. And another aspect that we can get into is just, we remember the Xbox 360 versions of games were usually much better than the PS3, despite the PS3's power. It was a big issue with just people couldn't really figure out how to develop games properly. So it was like they got ported over from 360. So a lot of times, even though it's like PlayStation 3 is supposed to be way more powerful, the better way to play it was on the 360.
Yeah, and we spent last week talking about how the launch of the 360 wasn't favorable, but in its own way, there wasn't any hardware issues, or widespread hardware issues, I should say. The PS3 might have had an even worse launch just because of, like Ryan said, them constantly getting in their own ways, them always playing catch up for a very large part of the generation. And it really took the consoles a while to get to the point that they became these revered systems. And Xbox just kind of got there a little quicker than PlayStation, and I think that's a lot of the reason why it dominated most of the generation. It's fascinating seeing those sales numbers because, almost the narrative of it doesn't reflect on that, and how PlayStation got there in the end, even though it's just by a couple of million units. That's still a significant chunk of consoles. But yeah, Sony just, even though there wasn't any lawsuits at the time, even though there wasn't any widespread hardware issues, for every Red Ring, there was still a Ridge Racer and all of those issues, getting a second job. And like Ryan said, them having their own, proprietary development system where it was, I think the line that they used is the PlayStation 3 was so good that developers would want to change everything up and develop for it.
They tried to sell that.
Yeah, they tried to sell it, and it was a miserable failure. And then, as you can see with their later consoles, totally gave up on that. So it was just a lot going against the PlayStation 3, and it took a while for it to catch up.
Yeah, I think ultimately the slim model, getting the price point down, by the end of the life cycle, it was probably affordable for people who had 360s to just pick up a PS3 at that point towards the end. And they still had some great titles coming up way up until the end, like The Last of Us. So people had a reason to get a PS3 right at the end of its life cycle. And I think that's how it basically just barely crossed the finish line ahead of the 360.
And I think something that doesn't get talked about enough is we mentioned the change from like CRT to high definition. And at the beginning of the generation, I was part of the bunch where, much like VR, until you try it, HD is stupid. Why would you need Blu-rays or HD DVDs or high definition games? I'm okay with how my games look. And I think that as the years progressed, you can't just say, oh, there was one reason why Sony triumphed at the end of the day. It's that it had a Blu-ray player and the price dropped as people became aware of high-definition TVs. I remember like high-definition TVs when they first came out, they were like $2,000 to $3,000. It was not something like I would go to Best Buy and I never thought in my life that I could actually buy one of those. But towards the end of the generation, you could get a pretty decent, like Vizio. That's where all these lesser expensive televisions came into fruition. And the other thing is, like, nowadays, think of how obsessed people are with HDR, 4K, 60 FPS, 120 hertz. If you mentioned any of these things back in 2008, people would be saying, what in the hell are you talking about? And I think people started whetting their appetites with 720p, 1080i, 1080p, that looks good. But then the refresh rate and then the contrast ratio. And out of the two consoles, which one offered a much better option for playing games and also watching movies? That. So I think in many ways, the same way that for the PS2, it was successful not just for the gaming part. I mean, we can't neglect the fact that the PS2 was my first DVD player and the PS3 was my first Blu-ray player. Like for you guys, was it also the same thing with both consoles?
Absolutely. It started out as it was like a luxury that the PS3 also did Blu-rays, but it got to the point where as the PS3 Slim came out and the price of consoles started dropping, a PS3 cost about as much as a Blu-ray player at one point, so there was no reason not to get a PlayStation 3 to play your Blu-rays instead of getting a Blu-ray player because
it was cheaper.
you're spending
here in Puerto Rico.
In cases, it was
a Blu-ray
cheaper.
player was like $800 to the console $600 something. And okay, so I could play games and watch movies and not use a sucky ass controller. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've ever even seen anyone with a straight up Blu-ray player, like just sitting in a household. I don't think I've ever seen that in my life. But PlayStation definitely, like Sony had the forethought that this was the technology that we're going to be going with. And I do remember thinking at the time, like towards the end of the PlayStation's life cycle, because again, like I said, 360 was really the standard and people would develop games for that. And towards the end, I was thinking like, man, 360 is kind of holding the PS3 back because people still want to develop for 360. So it felt like maybe games wouldn't be as large in scope because we knew a Blu-ray disc could fit a lot more data on it. Obviously, with installs and things like that, I guess you could get around it. But at the time, it felt more like, oh man, towards the end, that like PS3 was really just kind of outclassing the 360.
It's 100% because of, and you could almost consider this a failure of the 360, how HD DVD just didn't take off at all, because the option was there. They had a Blu-ray comparable, but when you put Blu-ray versus HD DVD, like I think Microsoft just bet on the wrong horse in that respect, and it was almost kind of like the opposite of the PS3 at the beginning of the life cycle situation, where as things went on and things got significantly better, don't get me wrong, but that HD DVD bet just kind of held it back, and I think that's around the time you really could see that shift in the PS3 move forward.
And I think that the most important thing, especially when tying into this episode, is that yes, technically the PS3 outsold the Xbox 360 at the end of the day, but when you look at the library and, we reacted to so many of the things like UI, we could make a list of 50 different things that the Xbox 360, to me, it's still one of my preferred gaming consoles, including multiple generations afterwards. And something that we would love is like, Ryan brought up a good question. I'm just curious, do we have any listeners that actually owned a Blu-ray player before they owned a PS3, like a standalone one? Let us know, Quest Rewind. And if you want to join the Discord, it is actually in the description of both the YouTube video, which you can enjoy this podcast in our lovely mugs there, or podcast feeds, and definitely drop that 5-star. So now Now that we have paved the way for this conversation, guys.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying our PlayStation 3 quest.
Yeah.
I think one last comment on that, though, it's like you see those memes or it's like what I do, what my friends think I do. I feel like in the moment for like that era of gaming systems, it was like if you were there, like who did it feel like won that era? I would say the Xbox 360. And then you're like, oh, who did it actually, or like, who do you think actually won? You know, the PS3, but who really won was the Wii.
Yeah, it's true.
And that's a conversation for another day.
Because I imagine the Wii beats both of these out, but I think it's a great... It's a good conversation to have to kind of set the tone of this, because all of what we just set aside, like, even though the PS3 sold more, and we discussed why, in my personal opinion, I still think the 360 is the better console of the two. And going by the PS3 versus 360 versus Wii, the 360 would be the worst selling console of that generation of the big three, but I consider it to be the best. So even though sales numbers are important from a business aspect and help shape your company moving forward, I don't always think it means it's the most important as far as a consumer product and reflection of that.
Yeah, if you were to say like, okay, if you had to own one console through the whole lifespan, like we can't just say, oh, it's the very end and all the games are out. Yeah. If you had to own one console through the whole lifespan, it would have to be the Xbox 360.
Oh yeah,
especially with the value of hindsight having it. Like if I looked back and said, if you could only own one of these, it would be the 360, no question.
Hey, we really hope you enjoyed this podcast clip, and if you did, guess what? You can listen to the full episode right now by searching for Quest Rewind on your favorite podcast app, including Spotify. And while you're at it, follow us over there so you never miss a new episode.